So, Governor-elect Brown, panelists, guests, I'm Gene Block, Chancellor of UCLA, and I'd like to welcome you to our campus. Sorry about the weather. The weather's usually beautiful here. But we're here for serious work. We're here to discuss really the most important issues facing the state, facing our society. Among those important issues, we all recognize that the adequate funding of K through 12 and higher education is going to be critical to the financial well-being of this state. We are really appreciative that the governor is already addressing this issue even before taking office, so we thank him for that. Well, let's get to work. And the first item of business, it's really my honor to introduce the governor-elect of California, the Honorable Jerry Brown.
Thank you. I don't know if you'll be cheering after the budget comes out, but I want to enjoy it while it's still here. Chancellor, thank you very much for hosting us for this forum. We're facing some pretty soft word. This is really a huge challenge, unprecedented in my lifetime. So we're here for a dialogue, to hear, to exchange ideas, to present the facts as best we can articulate them. My goal is to get some common understanding about the facts of the situation. Just what are the numbers? What is California facing? And all the institutions that our state government supports. That's really the plan. And for me, education is fundamental, as well as public safety. Those are the pillars of what a civilized society and its government are really based on. And we're going to do everything we can to minimize cuts to public schools. I can't promise you there won't be more cuts, because there will be. But we have a $28 billion deficit. It could be a little higher, a little lower, but that's the magnitude. And we're going to have to do everything we can to bring it within a balanced budget. Unlike the people in Washington, we don't print money in California. And we have a requirement that we balance our budgets. And unfortunately, over the last several decades, well, mostly in the last decade, but even before, there's been lots of techniques to, as they say, kick the can down the road, to obfuscate, to evade, and not to face the music, which in this case is there's far more commitments by way of spending than there are by way of the revenue that the people make available. As I've been going through this budget, and it's been an excruciatingly painful process, I've already taken 20% out of the governor's budget, and I'm going to find more. I'm going to start there because I think people at the top have to demonstrate the kind of example that will be required to get through this very, very difficult period. And I'm going to take a look at the agencies and wherever I can in government to squeeze out whatever we can do without. And after we get rid of what some people might call waste, we get rid of things that some other people would say, gee, we need that. But it's all a matter of ranking what do we need most and what do we need not quite so much. And when you're looking at 28 billion, you're in the 28, 29%. And you can look at wherever you are in the university or public schools or the prison system or corrections or mental health or old age assistance or anything else, Medi-Cal. It's got to come out of somewhere. And there has been some sense that you could get it all out of waste. But waste, of course, it all depends on the beholder in some cases. Now, there is waste by anybody's definition. But when you're looking at a budget of this magnitude, you're looking at a lot of things that a lot of people care very deeply about and very much depend on. And those are the things that are going to be cut back because we have no other choice. But I don't want anyone to think that we're not starting right where I go to work every day. So I've seen that office. It's got a lot more people in it today than it had the last time I was there. And it's going to have a lot fewer by the time I arrive on January 3rd. So that's where we start. I've asked our finance director Ana Manasantos to come here today to really outline the whole range of issues and facts that we're facing. Treasurer Bill Lockyer and Controller John Chung are also here, along with Superintendent-elect Tom Torlakson. So you'll have an opportunity to ask some questions, to lay it out, because after all, we're all in it together. This is California, and we're a rich state. That's the other side of the coin. California, as everybody likes to say, is the 8th largest political jurisdiction in the world. And that means just this last year, the new wealth, just the brand new wealth created by the businesses and the people of our state was about 1.9 trillion. And we're looking at 28 billion. So we're looking at a fraction in terms of the deficit of our overall wealth. And if we compare ourselves to the federal government or the European governments, we're doing extremely well. But that comparison is not very comforting when you go about putting the budget together. So, Anna, will you first outline the sources of the California revenue and our major spending categories?
This chart here illustrates what the sources of revenue are to the general fund. As you can see, the largest single source of revenue is the personal income tax at 53%. The bulk of the personal income tax comes from the top 1% of taxpayers. In 2009, 98% of 98,000 taxpayers accounted for 33% of personal income tax revenues. In 2006, that number was closer to 48% for 144,000 tax returns. This next slide captures where do our dollars go. As you can see, our largest general fund expenditure is K-12 education at 30%. If we add higher education, that's 40% of the budget. Our second largest general fund expenditure is in healthcare, and the biggest program there is the Medi-Cal program at 22% is spent on healthcare, human services, corrections, and other expenditures account for the balance of spending. And here, this chart tries to illustrate where our dollars go. And as you can see, 71% of general fund dollars go to fund local assistance, a variety of assistance to counties as well as services. State operations accounts for 13% of general fund expenditures. UC and CSU account for 5.3%. Debt service, pension costs, etc. account for the balance.
Okay, the next slide shows some of the examples of the general fund. And we say general fund because that's where the deficit is. The special funds, motor vehicle account, and fees that are collected, those tend to be more stable, and in fact, they're so stable that the general fund borrows from them. But our major problem by far is the general fund. And if you just look at this particular slide, you see the Medi-Cal is 17.6 billion. The entire state prison system is about 9 billion. All funding for UC and the Cal State University system is 5.4 billion. The services to development of the disabled, 3.1 billion. CalWorks is 3 billion. State mental hospital is 1.2, and the entire state employee payroll is 9.2 billion. So now you're talking about 28 billion, and you can arrange that in whatever way you want, but it's coming out of those programs. So that's pretty chilling. I don't know whether everybody that kind of sinks in, but it's pretty darn dramatic when you start finding where are you going to pick 28 billion out of all those different numbers. Now the next slide shows the most recent estimates of next year's budget problem. You can see that the Legislative Analyst's Office projected 25.4 billion. That was what they thought would be the gap between the taxes collected and the spending obligations that are locked into law. Now we add another 2.7 billion, and that's because the law, the federal law, was that the estate tax was coming back. And when we used to have the estate tax, The state got a small slice of it, which in this case would be about $2.7 billion for the last 2 years. Unfortunately, it seems like the federal government is basically going to get rid of the estate tax, and they're going to do it in such a way that the states are not going to get their small piece that used to be available on an annual basis. So that's why you have to add those two numbers to get the total deficit that we're facing. Okay, Anna, can you explain the next slide?
Sure. This next slide captures the major things that are changing between this year and next year. And as you can see, two of the big factors are, first, revenues were temporarily high this year. When the temporary tax increases that were enacted in 2009 go away, that will account for about $8.3 billion of the change in our revenues. One-time revenues included in last year's budget, including the sale of state buildings and other one-time solutions, account for the revenues being lower next year than they were this year. Also, the federal stimulus funds, another one-time solution that helped balance the budget in 2008, 9, 9, 10, and 10, 11, is they're largely going to go away, so the general fund spending will increase.
Anna, can you explain why you're expecting next year to be so much worse than the current year? You've probably heard the current year, even after they just struggled and came up with a budget in October, all of a sudden, $6 billion deficit pops up. That's what it is this year, after it was supposedly balanced a couple of months ago. But now, in the coming years, and just lay out what that slide tells us.
So as you can see here, $6.1 billion is the legislative analyst estimate of the carry-in deficit into this next year, because of largely one-time solutions not materializing, changes in revenues and other factors. So you can also see the forecast for the following 5 years is of a structural budget deficit of roughly $20 billion. That is partly based on reliance on one-time solutions and a very modest economic recovery forecast that assumes that our revenues are going to remain at these much lower levels for the foreseeable future.
Okay, and just what you're looking at is not the whole story. There's more and worse coming up in the future. So, Anna, you want to outline that?
Sure. As you can see, in addition to the immediate forecast, there are a series of pressures and threats to our budget into the future. One that's much has been discussed about is pension liabilities. The estimates by the pension systems is roughly $100 billion in pension liabilities. Other estimates are as high as $500 billion. The Unemployment Insurance Fund also faces its own deficit, now projected at $10.3 billion. Outstanding budgetary obligations and a budgetary borrowing, the largest one of being the economic recovery bonds issued in 2004, account for $15.3 billion, and the implementation of healthcare reform is going to add about $3.5 billion in general fund costs to our budget.
And I might just add to that, the healthcare reform, this is going to take a few years, but when it kicks in, we're looking at an annual expenditure on the state of $3.5 billion. Now, presumably the state will have more wealth then, and we have time to prepare. But it is a brand new, fresh, additional burden, because as you add under the federal health care millions of more people under Medi-Cal, the rates will probably be forced up because there won't be enough providers to take care of all the new people that are going to be put on the Medi-Cal rolls. And then the line on top of it about pension liabilities, this is the teacher's pension, the state PERS system, and the University of California pension. And the great variation depends primarily on the stock market and what one might expect. And the low number, 100 billion, is premised on a very, very robust and lucrative return coming out of the investments that are made by all these pension funds. And so the high number are by people who say, well, wait a minute, to be really sure, you ought to expect only more conservative returns. And if you take a rather conservative return, then you get closer to the 500 billion. And if you take what Warren Buffett would say, he would probably come down somewhere in the middle, I think. All right, the next slide, about the solutions. These are the solutions. It's an interesting word. They used to talk about taxes and cuts, but since taxes and cuts are both equally unattractive, the people in Sacramento have come up with another word. It's called a solution. But be careful of solutions. If you look at these so-called solutions, that in the '09 budget, 75% really didn't materialize. So it was a non-solution solution, but it gets you out of town. And that's the key point here, to get out of town. Of course, under the new budget system, if they don't solve the budget, they don't get paid. So that may introduce a new ingredient going forward. The next, in 2010, 84% of the so-called budget solutions didn't materialize. And then in 10-11, 85%. So that's a pretty sorry record. And I understand if they didn't do that, you'd feel even more real reductions or some kind of taxes. So these are the kind of dilemmas we're in. And each year, we've been getting this kind of non-solution solution. But now the day of reckoning is upon us. And I am determined to bite the bullet, get it done in whatever way the consensus of California can be built. Fair, transparent, and enduring. That's my goal, and I don't want to sit around for the next 4 years at this stage of my life and continue the same game of obfuscation, evasion, and ultimately destruction of what our public sector ought to look like. Okay, Anna, the next one talks about some of the short-term solutions. Can you run through that?
Sure. As you can see here, there's a list of different types of solutions that have been enacted in the last decade, amounting to $66 billion. This is a subset of the types of solutions that have been enacted. Temporary solutions accounted for about 25.7 billion in solutions. You can see the economic stimulus funds, federal stimulus funds accounted for 17.4 billion in solutions. Expiring tax measures, 8.3. Over the time that they've been in effect, they accounted for about $19 billion in solutions. There's a number of solutions that can't be repeated. Revenue acceleration, so collecting some of next year's revenues this year for personal income taxes and corporate taxes. Shift of property taxes from redevelopment agencies to fund education and reduce general fund expenditures. Accounting changes in the Medi-Cal program. The shift of state employee payroll costs from June 30th to July 1st. Those account for about $10.3 billion in solutions. There are also other solutions that have been enacted in the past that have made the budget, future budget worse. Those include the economic recovery bonds at about $14.6 billion, the sale of tobacco settlement revenues, loans from special funds, borrowing from local government, sale of state buildings, and deferral of state mandates. These solutions account for $2.8 billion of the problem in 11-12 is associated with previous solutions that now cost more. There were one-time solutions that have added to our deficit problem.
Okay. So, Tom, do you have a question for Anna?
Yes, Anna, people often say that Californians say that we're overtaxed, we spend too much. Could you give us some statistics on that question of the level of revenues, taxation compared to our spending?
Sure. If we look here, California ranks 15th in taxes and fees compared to other states. It's a combination of state and local fees and taxes compared to $100 of personal income at 17.22. There are some outliers like Alaska based on their reliance on oil revenues, but you can see California is 15th in the nation. If we look on the number of employees compared to other states, California ranks 4th lowest in the number of state employees per 10,000 residents in 2009. When we look at state and local government employees combined, California ranks 6th lowest in the nation.
Anna, do you have any statistics about how California school spending compares to other states?
Sure. This first chart captures California's pupil to staff ratios, and they're among the highest in the nation. If we look at our students per teachers, California ranks 49th. If we looked at students per counselor, California also ranks 49th. If we looked at students per librarian, we rank 50th, and students per school administrators, we rank 47th. in the nation. If we look at our per student expenditures in 2008-9, California ranked 43rd at 8,322 in the nation. This includes the District of Columbia, hence 51 instead of 50. And when we looked at our salaries, California's higher cost of living also tracks with higher teacher salaries than other states have.
Okay, Anna, we all know that Proposition 98 guarantees a certain level of spending on our kindergarten through community college schools. Can you discuss the next slide?
Sure. If we look here at what's happened to Proposition 98 funding, so state and property tax funding for K-12 and community colleges, in 2007-8, the Proposition 98 guarantee was $56.6 billion. As you can see, the revenue decline also resulted in a significant reduction in funding for K-12 and community colleges. It dropped to 49.1. The LAO's estimates for what the Prop 98 guarantee will be in 2011-12 has it dropping from this year's level of $49.4 billion to about $47.5 billion.
And I would like to make a point here. The state, I believe the legislature, the finance department, legislative analysts, the general practice is to assume certain revenue going forward for several years. And it never happens, at least as far as I can determine, that people predict there'll be a recession. And yet we always get recessions every 3 or 4 years. And what that means is that there's a false sense that there's money that's coming in that will never come in. And that's why we get these deficits quite regularly. We get them in almost during the period of every governorship. And when there's a period where you look like you have a lot of money, you might say at the top of the business cycle or the boom, then you project that forward and you think things look pretty good. But then things fall off because of the up and down of the market. And what would make sense would be, of course, to have a rainy day fund, some kind of reserve or surplus to even out the period where the revenues drop off. But that never happens. In fact, some political leaders in times past have actually said that it's obscene for the state to ever have a surplus. But if it's obscene to have a surplus, that means that every 3 or 4 or 5 years there will be the downturn and we have to face all these cuts, because it is not a straight line upward, but it's a zigzag line. Now, as we came into this, the worst recession since the Depression, the state was already in the hole. So you have a massive fall off in revenues, unprecedented, starting from a time when the state, far from having a surplus, was already in deficit because of some of the things we've been talking about. So that's why we're at an unprecedented moment of reckoning. This perfect storm, I think, is the worst it's ever been, because we're not quite in the same position in the Depression, where government played a much smaller role in the life of our communities than it does today. So when we get this level of deficit, it has a much more drastic impact, and that's why managing this budget is going to be so difficult and requires that we all pitch in and really know what, find out the best ways we can handle it. Now, as part of the process, of course, we borrow money. And over the last 7 years, the debt indebtedness that we've all assumed through our leaders has tripled. And Bill Lockyer can explain how that all works.
Thank you, Governor Brown, and appreciate your reconvening this event in Los Angeles, and for a broader effort to communicate honestly with people about the budget. Communication is important because, as all good teachers know, the best answers are the ones we discover together. Well, as you mentioned, one of my responsibilities is to sell bonds, and we've noticed, of course, that our outstanding debt has grown in recent years. The general fund has had a larger obligation paying off debt, and then I want to talk a bit about how the rating agencies and market view California's credit and how that hurts taxpayers. So the first chart shows that debt trend over the last several years. It's increased 266% in 7.5 years, from 34 plus billion to 91.3 billion now. Now, I should note that much of the increase is attributable to making investments in California's declining infrastructure, and the voters have authorized much of that debt issuance, and that also to mention that those infrastructure projects that are financed have created tens of thousands of jobs, private sector jobs, throughout the state, and have helped our communities, businesses, and working families. But of course, as the bonds are sold, debt service also increases, and this slide shows how that has affected the budget. Interest on outstanding debt has grown from $2.5 billion to almost $6 billion. As a percentage of the state's general fund, debt service grown from 3.5% to more than 6.5%. So every dollar, of course, that's used to pay off debt is not available to educate kids or provide health care or public safety or other needs. So obviously, as this portion of the general fund expands, public services continue to shrink. We do have a chart showing bond issuance for educational facilities, since some of our focus is on that today, and it's actually a fairly encouraging sign of community support. The state in the last 7 years has sold more than $21 billion of bonds for K-12 facilities and another $7 billion for higher education. And of course, if you add in what's happened locally at the community level, they've sold K-12 bonds of about $40 billion and higher education bonds in excess of $14 billion. So over the last 7 years, $82 billion worth of capital outlay investments in our schools and colleges. The local folks have also adopted a variety of local bond and tax measures that have, of course, added to local revenues and tax burdens. And just to indicate, this last round of November 10 elections, there were 195 measures on the ballot, that both tax measures and bond measures locally. 115 of them passed. 47 of those were bond measures. The total new debt from this last elections with local bond issues was approaching $4 billion that were adopted by voters this fall. Well, there's a lot of bonds that have been authorized by the voters or by the legislature that haven't yet been brought to market. And that's, of course, one of the things we try to figure out is when is the best time to go to market, both to meet the needs for various capital expenditures and to do it in a way that doesn't produce some sort of glut that hurts existing purchasers of investors in our bonds and doesn't contribute to market impacts because of excess supply. So we have yet to sell $37 billion of bonds that have been approved by the voters and an additional $17 billion that have been authorized by the legislature. Now, if we bring those to market in the likely schedule that meets current demands or wishes of people that want to build a new building at their school or their university or whatever, freeway, etc., we would expect debt service payments to continue to grow, and 2 years from now, it's larger than 10% of the state general fund. So I suppose the lesson of this particular slide is that capital investment and debt management should be fully integrated into budget planning and prioritizing. Let me talk for a moment then about California's credit ratings, and it starts with this unfortunate fact that while we're the 8th largest economy on the planet, as the governor and others have mentioned, we have the worst credit rating of any state. There are a lot of reasons for that. Some are fair, some maybe not so fair, but it's a fact of life that we have to deal with. And so when I engage in conversations with the rating agencies to try to understand, why do we pay a significant premium for debt issuance in California, the kinds of comments that you hear from them are, well, you might look at the yellow, I guess, reliance on one-time solutions, as the governor indicated with his chart, deficit borrowing, persistent structural imbalances, insufficient financial liquidity, the inflexibility imposed by voter initiatives, and a partisan policy-making environment. Sometimes they suggest that we might get downgraded, and that we're always sometimes on negative watch, and there's some worry that our credit could deteriorate further, and of course it has a ripple effect throughout issuers in the state. So when it happens to the state, improvements or erosion in quality affects the cities and the school districts and the university and so on. So in looking ahead, what would make them considered further downgrades? The typical comments are an absence of progress toward resolving the structural gap between revenues and expenditures. And I'm convinced that this governor is determined to resolve that. It may, I guess, take a while, but the sooner the better. And I'm eager to work with you in those ways to get this done. So then the unwillingness to tackle difficulties in the next couple of years and the lack of legislative or administrative resolve. Well, hopefully we can work through these things, but let me mention as well that because of our low credit rating and the general market conditions and so on, California taxpayers pay a substantial premium for debt issuance. And so you don't have to concentrate here on a lot of the little squiggly lines. The bottom line basically is we pay about 1.10% higher interest rates on our long-term bonds than would be the case if we were a AAA issuer. We're A-. And in the bond world, that's a lot of money. What it means to taxpayers with the debt we have and what we anticipate someday going to market with, that over the 30-year life of bonds, you pay about $12 billion more than you would otherwise pay with a better rating. Well, what can we do about it? And I've mentioned before, I kind of don't particularly like being the town grouch, though I'm getting used to it. But the solutions are, kind of easy to say and hard to do. But they're lose the gimmicks, honest solutions, more accurate revenue projections, no more deficit borrowing, better midterm adjustment mechanisms to assure adequate cash flow, a longer-term thinking as to budget planning and prioritizing. I know it's easier said than done, but I'm eager, Governor, to work with you and your team to get this resolved. Thank you.
Thank you, Bill. All this talk about debt highlights the fact that Americans are going into debt, average Americans. And if you look over the various reports that are coming out, there was a mention this morning in the New York Times on the editorial page about the growth in inequality. And what this means is that average Californians, and it's true all over America, are earning less relative to those in the top 1% or the top 10%. And because they have less, the way the economy has kept their spending up is by increasing their indebtedness. And so from income, people have had to substitute growing levels of debt, whether students or just families using their credit card or their homes, whatever they could do, they have used borrowing to keep up the spending patterns that enable the economy to continue advancing. But with the meltdown in 2007, there's this process called deleveraging. And I know everybody knows what that is, but it's good to recall that deleveraging means you pay down your debt. And when you're paying down your debt, you're not buying a new television set, or you're not buying more things, or a car or a house. You're just paying off your creditors. And that's pretty much where the whole country is today, and that's one of the reasons why things are growing very slowly. In fact, the report that I saw and was mentioned this morning in the New York Times is that the income redistribution that has occurred upward from the middle class and below is now at a level comparable to the pre-Depression 1920s. So what we're facing here is not only a budget deficit, we're facing a societal crisis, and we're only going to resolve it as we understand it and we work not only to exercise a discipline, which has been sadly lacking, but also a fairness that enables everybody to feel they have an honest stake in the whole society. And that's really the larger picture here in which we're looking at the numbers. So in order to get from where we are to where we want to go, we have to manage cash. And cash is something different than the budget, and John Chung will explain the mysteries of that particular aspect of our problem.
Thank you, Governor-elect Brown. I especially appreciate you convening this. I think it's absolutely critical that people have a sense and an understanding of where the state has been and what we need to do to move forward. The governor asked me to share with you what has transpired in California over the past few years from a sense of the cash perspective. So California has last been operating or had a positive cash balance on July 12, 2007. July 12, 2007. Now, the importance of that date is it predates the nation entering into a recession. The National Bureau of Economic Research declared the recession in the United States occurring on December of 2007. In California, we saw a rapid deterioration in economic activity, tremendous job losses, real estate leading us into that particular arena. Now, what has happened is when Anna, for the governor, indicated the three major sources of tax revenues: income taxes, sales taxes, corporate taxes. If you have an unemployment rate today in California of 12.4%, which we've had for the last 3 years, you can experience major deterioration in the state's tax revenues, and that's what we have experienced. Now, it has tremendous consequences, and the education community has borne a tremendous brunt. So going into 2008 and 2009, we saw a deterioration in the national economy with the fiscal financial crisis that occurred at major institutions going under. We had a commodity crisis in the first quarter. We also had Bear Stearns going bankrupt. We had the largest bankruptcy happening in the fourth quarter, September 14th, 15th, that weekend with Lehman Brothers. And during that period of time, Bill chairs the Pooled Money Investment Board. We provide interim loans for many of the infrastructure activities. The Department of Finance and I are the other two members, and we had to shut down temporarily the financing for nearly 5,400 infrastructure projects. That has a major toll to economic growth here in California. Every $1 billion, according from Bill's office, creates 16,000 to 18,000 jobs for construction activity. In January of 2007, as the state's cash manager, I was in the position where the state had $2.7 billion in the state treasury. Sounds like a lot of money. $3.3 billion were expected tax revenues for the month of February. However, from a budgetary perspective, I was facing $10 billion worth of bills that I had to pay. Now, the consequences are this. If I had let the state run out of cash, the state would have been insolvent. Under the federal bank law, bankruptcy provisions, a state cannot file for bankruptcy. We had Arkansas in trouble during the Great Depression, so they created the bankruptcy laws in 1937. However, we could have a near equivalent. Schools would be shutting down. Healthcare for the indigent and vulnerable would be, in large aspects, eliminated. Infrastructure projects would be stopped and halted, and so this state would be in chaos. And so that's what I was trying to manage through. Now, the education community had to pay a terrible price during that period of time. I could not make payments on $3 billion of tax refunds to individuals. My poor receptionists were getting yelled at all over the place. The college students were not receiving Cal Grants. I want to thank UCLA and the other institutions of higher learning. When Jim Lombard of my staff and others were contacting the institutions of higher learning, you stood up and said you would not disenroll a single student. They shouldn't bear the price when the elected officials don't provide for a balanced budget. And then President Obama's administration continued to make the payments for SSI, so we weren't putting the vulnerable out on the streets. Now, the governor and legislature put together a budget, not this governor, the current governor, that they came to agreement on February 23rd. The economy is so rapidly deteriorating that their Budget Act projections for April, 2 months later, the actual tax revenues came in $2 billion short. And so in May of that time, Bill and I were warning, along with, that I would have to issue IOUs in July. And because we did not get a solution to the budget and the cash shortage, I started issuing IOUs. Now, I try to manage cash so that under the California Constitution, education is the #1 payment, debt service is the #2 payment. However, all the other states have debt service as the #1 payment because that's what leads to the default of our debt obligations and leads to the insolvency. So we approached you, the education community, and asked you to wait for your payments. Now, you articulated great concern, but as when I explained that we would default on our debt obligation, you stood up and you bore that brunt. And you bore the brunt again this year because you agreed to, and the UC system was absolutely incredible again, on the cash deferrals. What Jerry is trying to do is get us to a better place where you don't have to take year after year, solution after solution, the brunt. Because we all know that if we want to move an economy forward, there are 3 things. #1, human capital, the skill set of the people. 2, access to financial capital. And 3, infrastructure. And you are leading the charge at the forefront. And if we don't educate properly, we continue to see a path today that has California and America headed in the right direction. We used to be the #1 or #2 place for the best education, and worldwide today we are falling to 12th or 13th. That is not a sustainable path. So what is clear from the message is that we have to understand the difference between budget and cash, budget our projected spending plans based on estimated revenues and expenditures. Cash is the actual money that we have on a day-to-day basis. The decisions the legislature and governor make are absolutely critical to the state's treasury so that we can pay our bills. Chart #1, Anna, if you could pull that up, shows the state's current cash outlook for the remaining 7 months of the fiscal year. We are looking at based on the May revise. So what it indicates is, under the first scenario, that the Budget Act assumptions are realized in full. The second shows that $6.5 billion in high-risk assumptions identified by the legislative analysts failed to materialize. And the third scenario indicates, takes scenario 2 and assumes that the sale of the 11 state properties for $1.2 billion in new general fund revenues don't go through. Some of you saw in the news or yesterday that an appeals court judge held up the sales for those buildings. That would be an additional concern for the governor-elect and Anna. Not the validity, but the cash concerns. Now, the positive news, unlike prior years, is if you see that we're still positive in regards to cash. Now, that includes substantial borrowed cash, so it's not a positive cash balance as I indicated earlier. But $4.2 billion, so we don't have the immediate cash concerns that we had just a few months ago, and certainly for the 2 prior years. However, it's still a matter of great concern because we see a very different story in July. Without an on-time balanced budget built on honest solutions, we face a cash crunch at the very beginning of the new fiscal year. At our July low point, we could be $2.3 billion in the red. Now, you have to understand, in the Comptroller's office, we try to maintain a $2.5 billion cash cushion because we have extraordinary volatility in revenues. We could have a great day for tax collections, but the next day we could have an incredible day for incredible disbursements. Each year in the Comptroller's office, we do $44.5 million disbursements. It's my signature on your tax refund check. In August, we could be $3.5 billion in the red, and in September, we could be $4.6 billion in the red. Bill Mack, Anna, and I have been called the four horsemen of the apocalypse because we have brought sobering news. We have addressed legislators numerous times regarding the cash, and once again, this is absolutely critical. Bill talked a little bit about this, but how do we stop the next fiscal crisis? With a projected cash shortage that starts in 7 months, the worst thing that could happen is to do nothing at all. It took the governor and legislature 100 days to come to agreement on the budget, and again, the state would have had a cash crunch. We had cash deferral language that was passed in the spring, and again, the education community was very generous in providing a solution. But obviously, you've had to bear a greater burden to keep the state afloat. So it's important that we don't put off the tough decisions until the May revision. Solutions require time. If you have spending cuts or if you have tax increases, obviously the longer the duration, the smaller the consequence or the high end or the low end that you have to implement. Now, just last week, I met with my Council of Economic Advisors to get a sense of the economy. They believe that we have hit the bottom, however, that the growth, the recovery is going to be protracted and slow. It is expected that we are going to continue to have double-digit unemployment for the next couple of years. So it's going to be a challenge. So you can't, and even when you have an uptick in the economy, you have to remember, as we have with real estate and as we have with public equities, the state, in terms from a budget perspective, does not capture it all. There is a delay because we can all write off our losses if we experience any. So the state, if you have a 100% increase, the state doesn't capture that 100% increase. People can write down their losses. So now with the state relying on a cash flow borrowing to begin the fiscal year, let's go to chart number 2. So this indicates last year's May revision projected revenues of $5.1 billion, and in July, $8.1 billion in expenditures, and that's why you have a negative figure. Now, to smooth over the timing difference between expenditures and revenues, California, like most government agencies and some businesses, borrows for cash flow purposes. These are short-term notes. They're called revenue anticipation notes. Bill executes those notes, but they cannot be sold until a budget has been enacted. In other words, we have to show our creditors that we have to have a plan to pay them back. And so obviously, at the end of the fiscal year, you have to have sufficient cash to pay for those borrowings. No less important than an on-time budget is one that contains credible and lasting solutions. One-time solutions and credible accounting only turn today's problems into tomorrow's crises. Now let's go to chart number 3. This shows the short-term cash flow borrowing as a percentage of the general fund revenue, budget. It clearly demonstrates what I pointed out earlier, that our borrowing has spiked significantly, and has spiked since July 12, 2007. To get a sense of the internal borrowing that I referenced earlier, I am allowed to borrow legally from 710 internal funds. We have borrowed up to $20 billion. Now, that's not included in the deficit, but if you want to make the state whole, that's also an additional payment we have to make. We understand that's not going to take place immediately, but that's also part of the liabilities that at some point need to be included if we're going to get the state whole. Now, if you look at the trend lines, borrowing has almost doubled in the last 3 years since the 3 years prior to 2007. The average borrowing in the 3 years prior to July 2007 was nearly 12% of the general fund, and today it is 23.5%. Now, that doesn't, as I pointed out, capture everything. I talked about the short-term borrowing, does not include economic recovery bonds, and it does not include the $4.5 billion in payment deferrals to school, colleges, and local governments. we have to delever. The governor-elect pointed out that's absolutely critical. Every institution in America has increased their leverage over the last 2 decades. The especially great growth was in the financial community in terms of Wall Street. Part of our economic growth was the fact that we had increase in consumer activity. Historically, it's been about 2/3. A few years ago, it bumped up to 72%. The governor-elect quickly pointed out that this nation is starting to delever, so that 72% coming from consumer expenditures has dropped to 70%, but we are still heavily levered. And so that is part of the concerns that we have. So in closing, during the past 3 years, this state has been brought to its knees by a global recession that wreaked havoc on nearly every sector of our economy and resulted in an unemployment crisis unseen in modern California history. The lack of a timely and meaningful budget solution needed to bring government spending in line with its reduced revenues only amplified the state's fiscal troubles. The simple truth will repeat itself if lawmakers again retreat to the ideological corners and fail to form a timely budget crisis. It's critical that we not allow political paralysis to dominate upcoming deliberations, that we pass a budget that is honest and sound and provides adequate working capital, and we get back to using borrowing as a smoothing tool, not as a budget solution. And so, Governor-elect, I just want to thank you. You have made this effort go forward.
Thank you very much. It is complicated, and when you get into the politics, it gets all very simple as people point their fingers. The Superintendent of Instruction-elect, Tom Torkelson, has some of his own slides, which hopefully will not complicate things, but will clarify where we are, and I guess by this time, you've heard quite a lot. So, but Tom, what light can you shed on all the stuff we're talking about?
Well, thanks again, Governor Brown, for having this forum to focus on education and to be frank about the state of education in California and in our budget. As Chancellor Block said, as you have said repeatedly, it is vital, essential for the strength of our economy in the short term and the long term to have a strong education system. So we'll look at the numbers. These last 3 years have been terrible in terms of what the statistics mean. We want to look at the statistics and also something behind the statistics. What are the realities being faced in our classrooms? If we could go to the first slide and look at what has happened to Prop 98 spending. Prop 98 spending in the blue is the K-12 portion. The red is community colleges. Again, we're talking about in K-12, 6.3 million students, over 1,000 districts roughly, over around 10,000 schools in California. They've suffered a 20% decline in actual inflation-adjusted comparable dollars. So the K-12 loss over the 07-08 budget to the current budget is $11 billion. The impacts are huge. Most districts, we believe, we're getting statistics on this, have gone from the 180-day school year, which is one of the shortest in the modern world around the globe in competitive economies, to 175 days. Most of the schools in K-12 have gone in the elementary grades from 20 per one student, 20 students per one teacher to 30 to 35. So behind the loss of 20% in K-12 is this devastating impact on class size, shorter school year, freeze on purchasing textbooks and computers, professional development's virtually gone, less access to career education, arts, and sports. Those are part of the general impact of these cuts. The top level, you can't quite see it, but community colleges have suffered about an $800 million hit to their budget. Next slide, please. To translate it into what it means on the per pupil investment and our spending per pupil, you can see that we were around $9,000 per pupil before the last 3 years of terrible budget cuts. We're down to $7,300. That's again a 20% cutback in what is going into our K-12 public schools. It amounts to about $50,000 per classroom. What else does that mean? What it's meant for school boards and superintendents and teachers and classified, it's meant about 30,000 pink slips over the last 3 budget years, and the demoralization of faculty and staff because of that. It actually resulted in 21,000 layoffs of K-12 teachers. Classified, we're looking at tens of thousands of lost jobs, and those are the people, of course, who do the maintenance, the buses, fix the computers, clean the rooms after the day is done. Next slide. where do we stand then in our per pupil spending, our investment in the children in California, in the students of California? On the K-12 side, you see we're down close to Texas at around, and these are again inflation-adjusted dollars, around $8,100 per student. That is again far down from where we were a couple of years ago. The national average is $10,500 roughly, and you see compared to New York State, we're far behind some of the leading states in their per pupil investment. By the way, some of these leading states in their per pupil investment also have higher test scores. Next, this slide is somewhat familiar because Anna did a good job of pointing this out, but if you look where we rank compared to the rest of the 49 states, and some of you have taken U.S. geography, wonder how could we be 51st in the number of librarians. They rank Washington, D.C. schools in with the 50 states. But you see in total staff to students, we're 49th. In teachers, we're 50th. Librarians, 51st. Next. This slide tells us something about where we stand compared to the rest of the nation on our proficiencies and our tests. Only half the California students are proficient in the English language arts. We have made steady progress. The valiant work of teachers, administrators, school boards has resulted in incremental increases in proficiency, but we're still only half of our students being proficient in English language arts. In math, 46%. So these are some indicators. We know that they're not the full measurement of student success or school success, but it's important to see what it means. Where do we actually stand ranked against the other 50 states? In math scores, in 4th grade, we're 46th in the nation. In math scores, in 8th grade, we're 47th in the nation. In reading scores, we're 49th in the nation in 4th grade, and we're in 8th grade, 50th in the nation in reading. It's important on the next slide to look at the continuum of education, how each part of education works together and should work together for the strengthening of our economy and the good education of our students. We have about 3.5 million students in higher ed institutions. They have suffered a $2 billion loss over these budget years we're talking about. About 16% of their revenues have disappeared. We have seen huge impacts on our campuses in terms of cost increases. Fees at the CSUs have gone up about 65%, at UC about 45%, and the portion of state investment in our higher education institutions has continually gone downhill. Governor, you have appropriately focused on education as a key part of this budget. As was pointed out by Anna earlier, it's 40% of the budget. These statistics are stark and deeply disturbing numbers. They cry out for a balanced solution. A cuts-only budget would be devastating to education, as we're all well aware. And I think these numbers call out to the public and the taxpayers and voters who ask the question, how much should we invest in education and into the future of our students?
Thank you. Boy, that's a lot to digest, and I think it illustrates why these issues are so hard to deal with on a collective basis among 38 million people or 15 million voters. It's difficult to frame up what is at stake, and then after you pour in all the ideological excitement and views, differing as they are, it is quite a lot to manage. And that's why if we could bring more of the decision-making closer to the voters, maybe some of this can be simplified and people can make the kind of decisions that will really be in their best interest. Now, we do have some microphones, and we'd like to get any comments or questions from those of you in the audience who may wish to jump in. And I can appreciate it if you're a little bit hesitant after that drumbeat of data. But I thought I saw one bold person there, that man in the gray suit.
Good morning, thank you all. I'm either bold or stupid, but I'll try anyway.
Tell us where you're from.
My name's Elliot Duchamp. I'm superintendent of Harupa Unified School District. I'm also here representing a group of school superintendents in Riverside County. We have for a long time done everything in our part that we could to protect our end of the state budget. We recognize this is the most severe budget shortfall since the Great Depression. I don't think any of us probably in this room have seen a budget time worse than this. What we would like to do, first of all, thank you for having these forums. Congratulations on all of you on your recent elections, and I believe the state's in great hands. As a group of superintendents, we have survived the last couple of years. I'll tell you just about my district in particular. Last year, we laid off 158 teachers. Due to the ability to use class size reduction, flexibility, categorical program flexibility, and the jobs bill, and offering as good a retirement incentive as we can, we brought back all but 3 of them, 2 elementary and 1 foreign language teacher. Our hope was, over time, to be able to use that as a new base and not have to lay off additional teachers. I want to tell you that at least in our district, our associations, our board, our administration have held the line to spread the pain as much as possible. We've taken furlough days. We have cut every possible expenditure that we can. So as a group of superintendents, we would like to, we realize asking for more money is futile. The only place where we would like to see that is extend the local parcel tax to 55%. Give us an easier time of approaching our voters. I believe even in a relatively poor community of Harupa Unified School District, where we have approximately 72% of our students on free and reduced lunch, our parents, our voters, our citizens will support the public schools and will pay their fair share in order to have teachers in classrooms and books in kids' hands. We also support and would strongly encourage you to continue all local flexibility options, including class size reduction. Currently, we're running at about 24 to 28 students per class in K-3. What that's also allowed us to do, which is actually a good byproduct, where we had a large number of combination classes, we've all but eliminated them. And by using flexibility and not having to pay penalties, we've been able to really rid that problem of our teachers, which has been a very difficult one given the rigor of the curriculum and the instruction that we're delivering. We would encourage you to consider continuing the class size reduction flexibility, considering and extending flexibility of all categorical programs. We also hope you would limit the barriers to online instruction. There are a number of them, and currently the funding does not provide the cost. We think we are able to talk about that. There's some tweener that we could all reach and reach more students. It's not just a matter of the budget. It's a matter of being in the 21st century, being able to offer singleton classes. I will tell you, as a parent, 8 years ago, my son was able to take an online class because the district kind of stepped out and did something different. He took a class that was not offered. We think that should be available to all students. We would also like to eliminate all outdated statutory requirements that are duplicative, and enact meaningful school employment law reform. We'd also like to see just some kind of relief on mandate reporting and some kind of overall solution at the state whereby we don't have to report it, and maybe some type of block settlement for the districts as a whole. Again, I know Ms. Monastasi, I'm not sure I pronounced your name right, must have wrong from the laughs in the audience, but Governor-elect Brown, Superintendent-elect Torlakson, you have a very difficult job to do as superintendents across the state, I believe, and in Riverside County. We're here to help with solutions. Thank you.
Let me ask you, when you reference an online instruction, how much potential is there? And are you asking the state fund that, or that you be allowed to use that technology in some way where state law prevents today?
It's not so matter that the technology is not there, but the funding for it currently is at the independent study rate, which is really not enough to fund the cost of technology. The issue kind of runs in the friction in that when it's asynchronous, and students may be sitting at their desk at 2 in the morning. If any of you have teenagers, you know they may do that. It's very hard to provide accountability, but independent study currently is on a work-related, product-related accountability standard as opposed to time. Personally, I believe seat time is an outmoded conception, and we ought to be looking at just paid per unit so we can offer more flexibility to kids as well as ourselves. Not sure I answered your question, Governor.
Well, I don't know quite what the implications of making those shifts. Does that open everything up to a lot of confusion, or do you have a pathway here that might be helpful?
Well, any change, I think, is confusion, but there are pathways. There are districts, for example, Riverside Unified has opened a full curriculum. We'd like to be able to work more cooperatively with them, utilize our teachers, and get the adequate funding to pay for both. I mean, there's been development costs. There are also, numerous hardware costs, particularly in a district where many of the kids don't have computers at home.
I get it. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Yes. Gentleman here with it, looking at you, raising his hand. Yes. Yeah. Can we get a microphone over here?
Thank you, Governor-elect Brown. I have the pleasure of having you sign my college diploma in your first term, and I look at that, and it's good to have you back. My name is Bernie Reinerson from San Diego Unified School District, and I agree with many of the comments that he made, but I think I would ask you to look at the federal government, to look at the cuts that you've talked about here today and how you would approach it, and also help us at the local level. At the federal government, we need formula grants rather than race to the top that California didn't qualify for, and it's only going to a few states. What we need is federal funding for Title I on a formula basis, and we need to go to Washington to do that. Many of the race to the top states are now finding that it's costing them more to implement those solutions than the money they're getting from the federal government.
So I got to ask you, what is, when you say related to Title I?
Title I
how much you want to get from what bill? What?
Title I funds are poor schools, and it hasn't had the increases from the federal government.
So you want the federal government to increase?
We want the federal government to put money into Title I formula grants that all school districts can share in and all poor kids benefit from, rather than investing in competitive grants that only a few states benefit from.
I get it.
And
secondly,
and Governor, if I may add, want to work closely with you, because I think there is a lot of federal money we're not getting the maximum return to California, and this is just one example of that, and it should come back in an easier way to be implemented in the districts.
Okay, good.
Thank you. We agree. Also, I've recently seen a study that K-12 education since 2008 has taken the brunt of cuts, and we can't take any more cuts. We really need to look elsewhere. We are at the cliff. And then finally, I agree with help us locally. San Diego Unified just had a parcel tax on the ballot. We got 51% vote in an anti-tax environment. We need a 55% measure for our parcel tax so that our voters can work to fund schools locally. And I believe we could have done it, and we'll go back to the voters. We were close to the 55% level, and we need to get that in California so local school districts can fund. So we need to look at improvements at federal, no more cuts to K-12 at the state level, and help us with local funding. Thank you, Governor. We look forward to working with you.
Thanks. Yes, over there to the right.
My name is Denise Rockwell Woods. I'm from United Teachers Los Angeles. I am a teacher by profession. The question that our members and the people in LA are thinking about, and I think maybe other teachers across the state is what's going to happen mid-year? We know we have these problems that you guys artfully told us this morning, but our concern is, are we going to have to do something in the mid-year to help save the budget? Are we going to be furloughing more teachers? Are we going to be laying people off? Health and Human Services personnel, classified personnel, what's going to happen mid-year? You said you want to save us, but there's going to be some cuts. Is something going to happen mid-year that we need to know?
All right, that's a good question. We've got our budget director right here, and I want her to give you whatever answer you feel comfortable with.
I think the projections to date focus on the changes between this year and next year, not necessarily changes this year. There are changes this year that affect revenues with the suspension of Prop 98 done in 1011. That really affects more what is the outstanding obligation, not necessarily what's the funding level in 1011. Now, how it's resolved will be a policy question, but in looking at the problem and the changes, it's really the comparison between this year and next year that LAO has been focusing on.
No, wait, that was a little complicated. Now, did I understand you to say there weren't going to be any cuts between now and June?
I think that the focus is on how to close 11-12 and the changes between 10-11 and 11-12.
It's after,
It's
for next year. Next year being starting on July 1st.
It's a policy call, but the projections are really looking at next year being lower than this year based on the current revenues.
But nothing in the next 6 months, unless something happens in Sacramento during the special session, which nobody expects.
Yeah, and the special session package did not include any additional changes to Prop 98 this year. The special session package maintained the Prop 98 funding level at the same level as it was in the Budget Act.
Okay.
Well,
Did you want to say something?
well, yeah, I'm the town grouch, so I'm the one that gets to say, you still have a multiple billion hole that needs to get addressed between now and July 1st. Now, it's fine to talk about, well, the projections are that because 98 is a percentage of revenues, and revenues are down, so before, it's a $2 billion cut for K-14 already built into the analysis. And we haven't addressed the $25 billion that's still short. So anyone that thinks that we're going to get by that without everyone getting hit probably should live in Mendocino County or some other place where, or Sacramento, which is, you know, budget solutions are largely from the tooth fairy. There are going to be cuts. And so I understand Anna saying, well, it doesn't look like there are going to be mid-year cuts in K-12. Okay. I'm a credentialed teacher too. I'm passionate about these things. But somebody has to keep saying you can't keep ducking this and rely on some new gimmick or illusion to balance the budget. And so far we've heard good ideas about how to spend more money. Great. It ain't there. And so it's time to make cuts. I believe deep cuts. I'd do the 25% across the board and just say, those that wanted less government, you're going to get your wish. And in other communities where they're willing to put something on the ballot to make up that difference, they're going to have a higher service level. But that's just Bill thinking out loud about these matters, and I know you want to get to solutions today, Governor, just the description of the problem, but it's frustrating to hear the solution to the problem is don't cut us, we're important, which is universally what everybody says, and spend more money. Sorry.
Well, yeah, and I saw a recent survey that asked voters to pick the percentage that voter believed was wasted in state government. And the average number picked was 48% waste. Now, I want to go look a little more carefully at that survey, but it is a bit ominous. I think we have a question over here on the left. Yes.
Thank you, Governor. David Sanchez, President of the California Teachers Association, and representing 325,000 certificated teachers and educational support professionals. First of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to be able to come before you and to hear the sobering news of what we have already known is that we're in trouble. And thank you, John, for not being the Grinch, but making us realize that, you know, we do have a problem. We recognize that. Last year, we lost over 30,000 teachers in the last couple of years. Public schools and community colleges have absorbed over 50% of the adopted budget cuts were placed on K-12 and community colleges. The favorite line that I like to use in my speeches is, there is no more meat on this bone to carve. The only thing left is amputation. So if we do what our Mr. Grinch wants to do, the possibility of shutting down schools is a reality. And is that really what we want to do? And the question becomes, you know, are we all working together to try and find solutions to the problems that we're facing with our state deficit? At the same time, do we put an emphasis and do we really care about the children of the state of California, because they are our future of this state and the future of this country is dependent on whether or not we have a good public education system for them to participate in. We have some very real hard challenges and decisions that we have to make, but we have to do this collaboratively. The finger pointing of who is responsible for what's doing what to whom has got to stop. And I believe that collaboratively and working together and continuing these discussions as you have prompted us to do this morning, we thank you, Governor-elect, for doing that. But in reality, we also understand that we have to make some very hard choices. Teachers up and down the state of California have given up to 2-week furlough days, given up 10 days of pay in order to try and help solve the employment crisis in their local school districts. And for them to do that is a big, big, big step on their behalf to keep jobs for our younger colleagues. But nonetheless, no one is looking into coming to the teaching profession as a career anymore because of the problems that we're facing now. What it was like when I first started teaching to what it is today is drastically different. And I know why young people don't want to consider a career in education. It's challenging, and why go in a profession where you may lose your job in the first 2 years, maybe 5 years. And with these projections that we've seen today, it's very, very, very scary. So, Governor-elect, thank you so much for the opportunity that we have here to come and listen and to be more sober, but we need to continue these discussions so that our children, who are the ones who we're talking about, are not going to be affected as they have been with the last 2 to 3 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And I want to just say our dilemma here, if you can believe these surveys, is there's the strong majority, way in the 60% don't want schools cut. But a strong majority in the 60s don't want new taxes. And the same can be said about public safety and probably the university. So we're in a dilemma as a society that we don't want certain things, and all those things don't all fit together. So that's kind of what we're looking at here, and that is the dilemma. And I just want to say, I thought long and hard before I ran for this job, and I knew it. I didn't quite know it was this bad. I knew it was pretty bad. But I want to say I did it at my age because I think I could be helpful. And I'm going to be the person that tells you the way it is. I'm going to try to be as eloquent and as accurate and as honest as I can in bringing people together in discussing our future as Californians. And at the same time, not just dialogue, but I'm going to take some actions. And I know there's some people that can take cuts a heck of a lot easier than others. And that's why when I walk in the governor's office and I see so many offices filled that weren't filled before, I know we can do with less. And I know there's a lot of agencies in state government we can do with less. And I know even the Attorney General's office, where we've cut back a lot, we're in a position in many ways to cut back more. And I have to say to some of the other people, let's see who has the most. I know we're all cutting back. And of course the great dilemma here is back in Congress, the tremendous solicitude for those people who have estates, you know, between 1 million and 10 million. They have to escape taxation because of the feeling that isn't good or right or fair. So this is the dilemma now. When we used all this leverage, we didn't have to examine the fairness and the distribution of how our society is put together. And there are limits. There are limits to the inequality and the harmony and the cohesion. And that's what both troubles me and challenges me, because I know that we're embarking upon a very uncertain period where, whether it's foreign policy, where we're spending all this money abroad, or domestic policy, where we're redistributing the wealth and retrenching in so many areas. This is a very difficult period. I'd say we've never had it before. It may be worse than the Depression in terms of the political pressures and the tearing of the social fabric. And I just wanted to assure everybody, my mission here is to do everything I can to get all of us as Californians to look at it honestly and to just examine where we are. And those who are the most privileged really have to take the lead. And that's why I want to set the example. A 20% cut, and heck, just listening here, I'm going to increase it to 25% and more before I get finished. And I guarantee you there's nobody that is prepared more to live within limits in common sense. Because I've been around long enough to remember a different era where things were a lot simpler. So I don't know how the hell we get there, but we are going to have to make a transition. And remember, we're not poor. We're one of the wealthiest places on the whole planet. So the question is, how do we, as a democratic society, not just say, me, I want. We have to work it out, and that's what politics is. Who gets what, how, when? And that's the strain on the process, because usually it's just more, and if you can't earn the more, just borrow the more. Well, now we're going to have to really see this allocation process conducted honestly, transparently, exhaustively. So that's why I hope people won't want to pass all these different bills. They're all nice, but there's only one big challenge to California, and that's how do we pay our bills and how do we keep this society together and going forward. So the woman in the back there, yes. Yes, you, right? You raise your hand, and I see you.
Yes, hi, I'm Shelley Spiegel-Coleman. I'm the Executive Director of Californians Together. We're a statewide coalition of 23 statewide organizations, parents, civil rights, and professional organizations, with a focus on improving policy and practice for children learning English in our schools. And we feel that there is a lot to be looked at in terms of the testing and the assessment system. There are a lot of tests and assessments that are being given to kids for whom they don't understand the language of the test. It's wasted money for administering those tests. Second grade test is not a mandate for any students from the federal government anywhere. It's a quantity of money that does not need to be expended. And then the accountability system that the state has organized to go out and monitor the schools. Much of that money spent on the accountability system needs to be directed on improving instruction and practices in the classroom, and not teams of people monitoring us and not looking at the students who actually need the support. We know that we have an opportunity now to take a look at the new reauthorized STAR testing program, and we think we need to take a whole new approach to what assessment and accountability needs to be. Not narrow the curriculum so students do not have the opportunity for science, social study, exploration, arts, and the music. So there is a way of looking at the money that's being spent to reappropriate that money so that policy really opens up education for more students in our state. And the testing system, one, we have an opportunity to look at it now. We need to take a serious examination of it. Thank you very much.
We'll definitely do that. I did note in the Race to the Top application the word data was mentioned, I don't know, was it hundreds of times? And I noticed some of the new careers that are being generated. I noted one with some interest, data monitor. And then you have data, no, not data monitor, data mentor. You can be, and that's important because when you're collecting all this data, you definitely need a lot of mentors to figure out what the hell it is.
Governor?
Yes.
If I may say that that's going to be a top priority of mine, and the transition team is already working on it, and we're going to set up a working team to look at the whole assessment process and the wiser investment of those dollars in the midst of this crisis.
Okay, and the state is building big computers in the education department, big computers for payroll and Anna's, I'm sure, really looking forward to all that new data. And then we have the courts that have the big giant computer that they're going to be able to keep track of everything. And I get it. Keeping track of more and more data is important. But I got some questions too, because we got to do real stuff, and then we got to get some data about what the real stuff is that we're doing, and not mistake one for the other, because you can get a big data stream with a bunch of people in the basement checking it out, but upstairs in the real world, things are falling apart. Yes, that gentleman over there.
My name is Phil Kwan, Superintendent of Cupertino Union School District. Governor, what I would like to request is that if you look at, we're all going to face the problems that the economy brings to us. We would like you and the legislators to please put all the sacred cows of categorical programs into the basket for flexibility so that school districts across the state can try to put together a survival plan. There are a number of categoricals that are still protected. I think they ought to all be in the same bin, and we all locally will make those decisions on where they go. And good luck, Governor. I appreciate your having this.
Now, some of those categoricals are federally required. But you're saying all, or?
I will say all state federal categoricals, and you can go to class size reduction as one of them. And also, please, continue the flexibility extension that we've been able to use to make budget. Those terminate in 12-13, and I think we need those flexibility provisions to go on into future years so that we can make budget.
Thank you.
Thank
yes,
you.
The gentleman in the light coat there, yes.
Governor Michael Holsizer here today on behalf of 47 school districts in Kern County, about 170,000 students. I just want to reflect a little bit on what you've identified as the purpose here today, which is for us to all start with a common ground of understanding. You've had some slides, particularly in your opening section, which we have been asking for 3 years, which is just an honest assessment of the share of cuts K-14 education has taken out of all budget cuts. Slide 9 in particular is very sobering. You've referred to it already once. In the last 3 years, in the first year, 2008-9, only 25% of the cuts were real, sustainable, and ongoing. The next year, even less, only 16%. This last year, only 15%. If you compare that slide to, I think, slide 16, you get an answer to the question, what role has K-14 education played overall in the cuts that have been made? And I think it speaks to what Mr. Lockyer is referring to earlier. My superintendents are not here to ask you to not cut education anymore. We understand that that's going to happen. What we ask you to do is reflect on your own data, which is that there's only been $16 billion over the last 3 years of real cuts, and K-14 education has been half of them, over $9 billion. Your own data tells us that. K-14 education is only 40% of the budget. So I'd ask the budget director, the finance director, to speak really clearly about, and continuing to speak very clearly as we move forward, what percentage of cuts have K-14 education taken? It's clearly over half the cuts, over half of the ongoing sustainable cuts. If we start there with that, as you say, Governor, that honest understanding of where we start, then we'll take our chances. We think you'll be fair, you'll be honest. That's all we ask. Thanks.
Thank you. And the environment, the fiscal, legal environment is such that some cuts are easier to attain than others. If you take, for example, our prison system, which is $9 billion, the federal courts are imposing more and more spending for particular health, mental health, various other access issues, all manner of issues. They're not imposing education requirements in the prison. They're not requiring that every prisoner have some program to get a GED or develop a skill. Maybe this will invite a lawsuit like that. But the health and the mental health have probably resulted in hundreds of millions. I mean, the number is very high. So then that becomes a federal judge, a federal court saying, thou shalt do this. And we don't need an analysis from the finance department. We don't need a debate. This is just do it. And we're getting a lot of those. Now, in terms of the health and welfare area, there were a lot of cuts made, and there are 50 pending lawsuits that my office, as Attorney General, is defending. In fact, we have some in the Supreme Court. So we have to get waivers. There's lots of rules now, what you can do and what you can't do. So we also have the constitutional restrictions in California. We have the federal rules that say, well, you took this money, now you have to follow our rules. And those rules are generally to spend more and more money. And so when we sit at the table to carve up the scarce funds, it's not an equal table because some people have special protections that give them greater protection. And now, some of those things can be changed through waivers, through changes in state law, and in the whole discussion, we have to have the people who represent prisons, because that's important, people who represent health and welfare and schools and universities, all of that. And then, of course, you have to have the business community because they're a group that feels probably more oppressed than the schools. If you go to some of these business groupings, they really feel like they're in the worst part, maybe the worst place in the universe, and they all want to leave. Now, some are not as extreme as others, but what we have is a very grumpy set of claimants. Now, if we could just get it honest and get everyone in the room, and so when something's being discussed over here at Health and Welfare, I hope some of the correctional people and the teacher people and the university people, we all have to look at it together. And it's very hard to compare apples and oranges and, school books. But that's what it is. It's a complex allocation of very different values and services that we have to look at. And I really feel that it's my job as the governor to make sure that we don't just focus on one part of the equation, whether it's this part of the budget or revenues or cuts, but try to see the whole picture and invite the people of California into the discussion. And that's what is difficult, because if you listen to some of this, I have to tell you, I can't follow some of these slides. The ones what we produced, I can understand. Chung slides are they leave me a little bit in the dark. But if we do this long enough, I'm going to figure them all out too. But I see the job is you got to be faithful to the complexity, but you got to articulate it very clearly and simply, because at the end of the day, this is not for elites. It's for ordinary people. We're a democracy, and we have to have the people a part of this equation. And I think I'm at least one of the key players that will get this whole discussion going, not just in this room, but throughout the whole state. And that's exactly what I intend to do until we wrestle this bear to the ground. And I'm not going to be too interested in other kind of initiatives that people want to promote in Sacramento. I think we got to deal with the overall aggregate imbalance between spending and revenue. That's our big challenge, and I hope everybody who's getting paid by the state in a position of responsibility will focus on that mostly. Yes. Right? Yes. With the red, I think that's red or maybe orange shirt.
Thank you, Governor. And again, I'd like to thank you and all the folks on the panel for being here today to share your information with us. I'm Joel Shapiro. I'm the superintendent in South Pasadena Unified School District. I think you stated something that we all need to pay attention to. You stated that about 60% of the people said they would like to protect education from further cuts, but 60% also said they don't want any additional taxes. I think that was roughly what you said. We can't have it both ways. So as we look into the future, I'm going to ask for you and for all of the legislators to take some very courageous positions, because there's just no more cuts to be made in education without devastating public education. We're already at the point where any further cuts may make it impossible for our system to recover and serve our students the way they need to be served. So as we look down the road, there are a couple of things that I think we'll need to look at. First of all, those temporary taxes that were passed need to be extended. Absolutely, we can't do without that revenue going forward. And we need to educate the voters of California for the need in one form or another or multiple forms, that the only way we're going to keep our education system from deteriorating worse is to increase revenue through taxes or fees of one kind or another, and not leave it up to local communities to have to pass parcel taxes or other measures to support their schools at the expense of students throughout the state. So I know it's going to take courage, because people are not interested in paying more taxes, but they'll need to be educated to know that we will not maintain a quality public education system if we do not increase revenue, and that's the only way we'll be able to do it. So I appreciate your efforts, and I have a great deal of confidence in your courage in this area.
Thank you. Remember, when we're talking about the voters, and we say we got to educate them, in some ways they got to educate us. So it's not really a we, them, it's a society, and there's a lot of hostility to government, and we look at things in Bell, and we pick up the paper and we see other things, fire chiefs getting $250,000 pensions. There's a lot of skepticism about the government and the political process. So that's a reality, and we have to take the world as we find it, and then we have to work through it. So it takes not only the desire for what we want, it takes the skill and the integrity to be able to engage in this civic discourse in a way with some positive outcomes. Yes, way in the back there, raising that piece of paper in your hand.
My name is John Perez. I'm not the speaker. I am the chair of the California Post-Secondary Education Commission, and Governor-elect, I want to congratulate you and all the other members for coming here today and talking to us. CPEC would like to ask you a favor, and that is one of the very best things CPEC does is we make grants to local universities and local school districts for what I call the best professional development in this state, and I'm a former teacher. That program, which is called Improving Teacher Quality, is on the cutting block at the national level. And we'd like you as governor, when you become governor, to ask the federal government not to cut that money, because if that money gets cut, this tremendous program, Improving Teacher Quality, which helps our teachers, our K-12 teachers, become better teachers, is going to be at risk. So I don't discount all the problems that we're talking about today, but this is just one little thing that our state agency does that is very, very good, that is at risk if the federal government cuts our funding. Thank you, Governor.
Okay, thank you. Yes, the gentleman straight in the back there in the dark suit.
Thank you, Governor. I'm James Johnson. I'm a Long Beach City Council member, and I'm on the Southern California Association of Governments. It sounds to me that the core question is this. You have a public who wants fundamentally more services and wants to pay less. So my question to you is, as leaders, how do we work to find a solution given that public attitude?
How do we work to square that circle? That's why we're here. We're hoping one of you people will come up with it. That's why we didn't gather here just to hear ourselves speak. We want to circulate and find out, get some ideas going. I do want to just again lay out what is our dilemma, that people don't see the same world. If you look at the electoral map and you see how the votes are distributed, it's amazing how people in one part of the state see such a different reality than people in another part of the state. And when we take so many local decisions and we put them all at the state capitol, then we have to have all these different perceptions working on the problem. And that's why we get a lot of breakdown and gridlock, because people see the world very differently. And that's been one of the, in some ways I find it rather shocking that I look at the world and I see it one way, and I talk to somebody else and they see it a totally different way. And that's our dilemma, and that's really the hurly-burly of the politics. How do we move forward? And on the one hand, we have to be very collaborative and open and bipartisan And on the other hand, we have to advance an agenda that we believe really makes sense. And we're up against a whole bunch of people who have very different beliefs about what the agenda, what's the agenda that makes sense. And that's just where we are. So that's why I say it takes skill, it takes eloquence, it takes integrity, so that we can earn the support and respect of that wide variety of people that constitutes a very strong majority of Californians.
If I could add to that, Governor, you use the word collaboration, and I think we have a challenge to all of us, because we serve the same families and the same students, to work collaboratively, and for cities to be part of the solution, for counties to be part of the solution, and to team up more than we currently do. Joint use, cutting down barriers. If we're doing solarization of school buildings in one district, how about teaming up with the community college district? And Jack Scott and I have talked about that. How about teaming up with cities, which are serving in the same school district area? Joint purchasing, and a whole host of areas where we can show the public that we're being wise with the dollars they're currently giving us. And I think what's happened, in the statistic you gave, Governor, about the 60% who believe there's a problem when no new taxes for schools, they haven't seen, because the schools have been so accommodating. They've kept the doors open, and they've worked diligently. One-time reserves, one-time tricks are gone now. The ARA money's gone, the Edu Jobs money's gone. And so this forum of education that you're starting here, this series of briefings, I think is a foundation for the public changing their attitude and being willing to invest more and vote for more revenues for our systems.
Thank you, Jim. The woman in the red, yeah.
Yes, I'm Sarah Miller McCune. I'm a publisher. I'm happy to pay more taxes if that's what it's going to take. And I think many of our over 1,000 employees around the world would feel the same. We publish in education, we publish in criminology and criminal justice, we publish in research methods. The publishing in education shows that schools' class size is a factor in how much and how well students learn. The publishing in criminology and criminal justice suggests that our prisons are populated by distorted numbers in terms of race and distorted numbers in terms of seriousness of crimes. Have you considered, number one, going to the federal judiciary and petitioning for deferment of the mandates for 3 to 5 years until the economy improves? Number two, have you considered the possibility of analyzing the prison population throughout California in the hopes of reducing, number one, overcrowding, but number two, ultimately of closing prisons and protecting us in terms of public safety by keeping dangerous and life-threatening criminals in jail, but turning to other solutions for young people who might still have a chance and who perhaps have been unjustly treated in the courts. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, just to respond, I will tell you this about the prisons. The healthcare has had some difficulties, and the management is now in the context of lawsuits, and there are literally hundreds of monitors and plaintiffs' attorneys wandering through the prisons, checking up on things. And the prison spending on health care has gone up very significantly. We're talking in the billions, not in the hundreds of millions. And things need to be managed well. And so one of my goals is to make sure that our prison system is managed well, that we're transparent, and that we can go back to the judges and tell them, look, we're providing adequate health care, and here's our proof of it. There have been some problems. I have to just tell you that there was a lawsuit during the time of Ronald Reagan that required legal materials in every prison. We finally succeeded in settling that lawsuit last year. It took us a long, long time. And I've tried to get an answer. Why is that? And to this day, I still haven't been able to get an adequate answer. So that would suggest to me that there's some management problems in the system. And I'm certainly committed to dealing with that to make sure that sector does not take a disproportionate share. Then the other point I would make is that, like everything else, people are looking to offload costs. And there are over 45,000 individuals who go to state prison, and they stay for 90 days or less. So that's an area that I really want to look into to see, well, is this something that could be handled at the local level, and would that take some funding? This raises the question of realignment. And I'm looking forward in the budget that I present to outline some realignment ideas that will cut across a number of state areas, because I think that's a very important part of handling the problem. And then third, in terms of people getting into prison, being from lower income kinds of families, what we used to call broken homes, I have to say that if you look at the children being born today, over 50% are born under the Medi-Cal system, which would suggest they're at relatively low incomes, because you can't have too many assets or very much income at all to be on Medi-Cal. So that's 50% of the children being born. So we're involved in a continuing redistribution, and we have migration in, and we have a lot of challenges. So we can't just focus on one. We have to look at schools, we have to look at prisons, we have to look at wages, we have to look at how workers are represented. We have to look at a lot of things, and that's what the election's all about. So we have a lot on the plate, and I'm trying to get the budget to the printer by December 15th. So all this will have to be digested by then. But then we get to work it out as we work through. And by the way, I'm going to try to get the budget agreements done within about 60 days. I don't think we have a lot of time to waste. Yes.
Good morning. I'm Terry Reagans from the Torrance Unified School District. I'm a school board member, so you folks are the higher up electeds. I'm way down on the bottom, the last sort of bastion before we get to the kids. And I do appreciate you taking your time to be here today to give us the true story. But I'm in my 8th year on the school district, and our $200 million budget has shrunken to about $160 million. So we have already 20% off the top. And that, for me, that translates to fewer services, less educational opportunity for each of our 25,000 students. I just wanted to bring it down to a level for you to think about. So that $160 million is very precious money. Please let us decide how to spend it. The flexibility is absolutely crucial. I just want to make another bid for that. And to invite you folks to take a little more time and actually visit schools. See what the kids are doing, what our teachers are doing, and see what the differences are now in the resources that they actually have in the classroom and what they used to have, and or what would be ideal if we actually could provide them with what we should be able to provide them with. And I think that that will help you to keep in mind those students that actually are the reason that we're talking about these dollars to begin with. And perhaps have you be able to realize that those individual kids are the ones that we're affecting by each and every decision we are talking about in terms of dollars and money. That's where it really all boils down to. So we're down there handing it down from where you folks give us the money, and we appreciate all your cooperation in doing that. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, that, as you debate things in Sacramento, it's more abstract. It's about the flow of money. I remember the first time I was governor, these various bills would come by, and it was very hard to say, well, what really is happening out in the classroom? What are the impacts? And you really don't know unless you've come out of the schools or you in some other way can can get a concrete idea. But the more abstract, and therefore the more centralized the decision, the less human face it's going to have on it. And I think that's part of the reason why we are in the mess that we're in. Yes.
I'm Patrick McCallum with the community colleges, and we have been working nonstop, that is the faculty, the chancellor, students, and trying to put some solutions and recommendations, Anna, to you as well, which we'll be glad to present. You know the kind of numbers of 2.7 million. You know the workforce that we train for. 70% of the workforce is going to be in California. It's $5,000 per student, the most efficient higher education system and maybe government in the country. But what I'd like to do is, I think Chancellor Scott is here, may want to have a question, is turn it over to Chancellor Scott and let him ask a question.
I was just going to ask you a question. Compared to the other states, where does California stand in fees for community colleges?
Our fees are the lowest in the country.
Okay.
And it's
good.
And what that has done, and what that has done is allowed the most access in the country. When fees go up, access goes down. So how you treat the fee issue, and I've heard that you've mentioned fees, is very important. Moderate and predictable, students can maybe adapt. Very high, rapid fees, you'll have a big sticker shock impact and lose students dramatically in this system. And so that now we're not educating California's workforce if you lose those students.
Got it. Does the Chancellor want to opine here?
Yes.
I know you've been calling me and I haven't responded, so now you have a chance. What were you calling me about?
Well, I was calling you in order that we might have a face-to-face meeting and I might talk to you about higher education, and I'd love to meet with you along with Chancellor Reed, who's here from CSU, and President Udolph. So that's really what I was calling you about. But let me say one thing, and I want to express my appreciation first that you've been so realistic. I think you're like a household financial advisor who's sitting down with a household and saying, hey, you know, your credit cards are overextended. We're going to have to cut up your credit cards, and we're going to have to face the reality. So I applaud you for the fact that you've been so candid and you've told us exactly where we stand. I also tell you that those of us who are in higher education and in K through 12 education will join you in that very, very difficult battle that is ahead when we face the voters in California and we say to them there has to be some additional revenues in order to face this problem, or else you'll have to undergo the most serious cuts, whether it's in health care or education or whatever. So I wanted to say I like the approach of being candid. I think always realism is in order, and certainly we can help you in articulating what we believe are the educational needs of the state. Last year, there were 140,000 students that we had to turn away. They couldn't get a class. And so we didn't want to do that, but of course we got an 8% cut that caused us to do that, and we couldn't offer all the classes that we want to offer in terms of workforce development, transfer education. As far as fees are concerned, I think I would join with Mr. McCollum in saying that, number one, if there is an increase, that it ought to be gradual and moderate. And frankly, we would like to keep the money. I don't know that we would get real excited about fees that simply went into the general fund, which would be a tax on the students who are the least able to be taxed. So that's the comment that I would make.
Thank you. Anybody else here? The woman in the green, I think that's green or turquoise in the back.
Good morning. I'm Joe Loss. I'm president of the California State PTA. And I want to start by thanking you very much for putting this together and allowing us an opportunity to dialogue with you about this opportunity for the budget that's coming up. And what we want to say to you as a solution, because that's what you've asked, is that the California State PTA has association authority, that our people, our members, have always been interested in a balanced approach to the state budget, and they've always been in favor of tax increases or revenue to increase the education budget. So to you today and to all of you who've come to talk to us, I'm offering our million members in support of a balanced approach to the California state budget. The schools have stayed open, and parents are starting to feel the pain. They're starting to get the sense that when they take their child to school, they're not getting the same opportunities that their child maybe 2 or 3 years older got, and they recognize that. But also our job as the PTA is to watch out for the most vulnerable child. So we really want you, and Governor-elect, you said it yourself, we really want you to watch all the areas where these children are affected, CalWORKS, Medi-Cal, all the things that make a difference for a child to be productive in our society. So again, as a solution, I say to you, the California State PTA, our 4,000 PTAs and our million members are in support of a balanced approach. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Someone way over there in the side, yeah, waving your hand there in the air with a slightly gray hair there. I'm sorry to use these descriptive adjectives, but that's the only way I can identify
Next
you.
time I'll wear a bright color. Louise Jaffe, I'm a trustee at Santa Monica College. I'm not speaking on behalf of the college, and I'm a former PTA high school president, elementary school president, and council president. And I would like to suggest that you and Superintendent-elect Torlakson and Chancellor Scott look at 11th and 12th grade and the first couple of years in basic skills education and community college. It seems to me that when we have, some of our community colleges have 1% of students coming that are qualified to take college level math or English, that when we have so many students that are graduating from high school and coming into community college so far below college level, that's an enormous waste for the state and for the student of time and money. And there's no requirement for math in 12th grade. I think that's a real area that's important for absolutely every reason. And if we're looking at having to rethink things, let's rethink 11th, 12th grade and getting students in a position to be successful by the time they get to community college.
Thank you. By the way back when, like 1981, 82, I proposed that in order to graduate, you had to have 3 years of math and 2 years of science. And way back in 1978, the former State Senator Gary Hart passed a bill that I signed that said every school district has to set graduation standards. We were looking at a decentralized set of criteria. So we've been at this thing for a long, long time. And it amazes me. I feel kind of like Rip Van Winkle coming back here after 28 years, and they're still having the same discussion. And I've just wondered what all those people did after I left. I realized they had some tough choices, but I just had to put that in. Yes, way in the back there, right there, you have your hand shielding your eyes there.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'm Lisa Korbatov. I'm board president at Beverly Hills Unified School District. I went about a year and a half ago to the Get Schooled program that Bill Gates Foundation put on, and Joel Klein, the Chancellor of New York Schools then, said for decades they thought if you solve poverty, you'll solve education. They now know if you solve education, you will solve poverty. We are fully 10% of the nation's population. We were the 5th biggest economy, now we've dropped to the 8th. If you look at the charts you showed us, 51st in libraries, they probably have more librarians in third world countries per pupil. And so what happens is our reading scores have gone down. If you look at targeted investment, return on investment, there's no greater investment than in kids and education. And so what's going to happen is we're not going to have kids ready for the kind of jobs that are available. We're not going to have people who are going to be as nimble and literate and employable as their parents. They're going to have a lower standard of living and quality of life. And we're going to be basically a banana republic in the state of California. And that's very worrisome as a Californian born and raised here. So I'd like to know, Governor, what is your long-term plan? Because it is a long-term problem. Thank you.
Well, that's why we're here, to develop some of the longer-term initiatives. And we have a short-term set of initiatives that will show up in the budget. And I think certainly there's a connection between education and the income of families, because if you look at the STAR tests or the API scores, you see, looks to me like a correlation. I haven't seen the exact number, but there's a lot there. Now, people, through outstanding teachers and very favorable conditions, can overcome some very adverse economic circumstances. And we see plenty of examples of those, but they tend to be the exception and not the rule. So if what you're saying is there's a relationship, you can't really say education, causes poverty, or poverty causes, or the lack of causes poverty, or vice versa. It's all, it's what you want to look at in. When you're looking at our society, you use different words to focus on different aspects. But it really ultimately comes down to what are people's life chances, how do people live, what do they focus on, what are their opportunities, what's their, how healthy are they, what knowledge do they have, what skills, and education plays an important role, but not the exclusive role. And then, of course, where you work and your income, that plays a role, and trying to get the more jobs and better wages, that's what they're trying to do back in Washington, and they're having a hard time at it. In fact, the economists are fighting. One of them says the debt's our problem, so we better stop borrowing and spending. The other one says if we don't borrow and spend more in the short term, we'll even have more debt. So the experts are in disagreement. So coming out here, I think we have to work on what we know, and it's a continuation of where we are, and we make it better incrementally. So my plan, quite frankly, is to have meetings such as this, have a series of private meetings, and to find out where I can forge consensus and agreement. And I'm going to do that not just in Sacramento among the legislators, although I intend to do that in a relentless and hopefully sensitive way, but I also intend to go throughout the state mobilizing, energizing, and listening to people, and where I see openings that will pave the way for positive initiatives, then I'm going to lead the charge. But I want to do it very carefully and very thoughtfully, because I want to make sure we succeed. Yes, the woman over. Yeah.
Good afternoon. My name is Martha Fleur. I'm the president of the California School Boards Association. I represent 1,000 school districts and 5,000 of our locally elected school board members. And Governor, I thank you very much for doing this. I'm very encouraged, and our membership is very encouraged that you have reached out to us and asking us for our opinions and our solutions and our suggestions. You met with a broader group. I'm a member of our CSBA, is a member of the Ed Coalition, and many of our members have spoken here, including the PTA, CTA, AXA. All of us are pledging our support for you in working with you to solve the solutions that are needed. And again, I want to remind everybody here that we've all talked about it. Revenue needs to be part of the solution, and we are encouraged that please understand that making deals behind closed doors with just a select few is not appropriate. And I know that you're pledged to transparency and you're pledged to listening to us, and we will work with you to come up with the solutions, and we pledge you our support. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, I think we've explored the issues in this 2-hour period. I thank all of you for coming. We have to, yes, the town grouch may offer one more sour note if he wishes.
Well, you heard, yeah, thank you. And you heard my sort of, not policy recommendation, but tactical analysis earlier, because I think absent a more successful effort to educate and engage California voters, what you're going to see is what I was suggesting to you were the options earlier. But here's the story I like to tell that's relevant. Half a century ago, 3 emerging countries, Jamaica, Nigeria, and Singapore, all have about the same per capita income, $2,200 approximately, as I recall. They said, okay, our future is tourism in Jamaica, resources development in Nigeria, and education in Singapore. A half a century later, Jamaica and Nigeria haven't kept up with inflation, $5,400 per capita income. Singapore, $24,000. The lesson is, I think, education works, and it's a smart investment for everybody. But you've heard the descriptions of what our constituents think. They aren't convinced of that, except in sort of the, it's great if I don't have to pay for it way. And so I just think, as one who sees the decline every day, because I have a second grader in public school, we got a lot of educating to do, and let's do that together. Thanks.
Okay, well, I'm glad you brought up Singapore, because I've had the biography of Lee Kuan Yew on my bookshelf for 2 years, and I'm going to read it. And if you will give me some of the authority that Lee Kuan Yew has, I guarantee you that we will make progress without question, or even just a little bit of the authority of Lee Kuan Yew. And I don't mean caning either. I don't need to go that far. So I want to close by saying, please sit down when you read the stories on the budget on January 10th. Don't stand up. But just sit down. If you're in a car, fasten your seatbelt, because it's going to be a rough ride, but we'll get through it. I have great confidence, and for whatever reason, I look forward to this with great zest and enthusiasm, and I'm not going to be a grouch about it. I'm going to be a happy warrior.
Talk to you again. Ooh, you ain't all that hurt. No, you that you can rely, but just like